She was falling, not stumbling, not tripping, but falling from the sky itself, spinning through the clouds 2 miles above the Amazon rainforest with nothing beneath her but an ocean of green. Somewhere above her, a passenger jet was scattering itself across the jungle in pieces. Somewhere below her, 91 people were about to die. And somewhere in between, a 17-year-old girl was about to do something that should have been physically impossible: survive. This is not a story pieced together from rumors or exaggerated for effect. This happened. On Christmas Eve, 1971, LANSA Flight 508 flew directly into a violent tropical storm over Peru, was struck by lightning, and broke apart mid-air. Of the 92 people on board, only one lived. Her name was Juliane Koepcke, and what she survived, and what she did afterward, has been studied by scientists, doctors, and aviation experts for over 5 decades, because by every reasonable measure of physics and human endurance, she should not be alive to tell this story. But falling from the sky was only the beginning. What came next was 11 days alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth: no food, no shelter, no rescue team searching in the right place, just a badly injured teenage girl with a concussion, a broken collarbone, and one eye swollen shut, wading through jungle rivers infested with predators most people only see in nightmares. No training, no equipment, just her wits, a sliver of childhood knowledge most people would have forgotten, and a decision that would either save her life or end it. What you're about to hear is not just a story of luck. It's a story of what the human mind and body are capable of when there is no other option left but to keep moving forward. You'll find out how a fall that should have killed her instead became one of the most studied survival cases in aviation history. You'll discover the small, almost unbelievable decision that guided her through the jungle when every other instinct would have led her in circles. And you'll learn exactly what she found, deep in the rainforest, on the 10th day, that finally changed everything. Stay until the end, because the final moment of this story, the one detail almost no one expects, is the part that turns this from a tragedy into one of the most remarkable true survival stories ever recorded. This is the true story of Juliane Koepcke, the girl who fell from the sky and lived. On December 24, 1971, 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke boarded LANSA Flight 508 in Lima, Peru, alongside her mother, Maria, a well-known ornithologist. The two were flying to Koepcke to spend Christmas with Juliane's father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, a respected zoologist. Both of Juliane's parents were German-born scientists who had settled in Peru and devoted much of their lives to studying the Amazon rainforest, running a research station called Panguana deep in the jungle. Juliane had grown up shuttling between the modern world of Lima and the wild, biologically dense environment of her parents' research camp, and this upbringing would soon prove to be the difference between life and death. The Lockheed L-188 Electra turboprop carrying 92 passengers and crew took off in fairly ordinary conditions, but as it flew over the dense, mountainous rainforest of eastern Peru, it flew directly into a severe tropical thunderstorm. Peru's rainy season made such storms common, and this one was violent even by regional standards. Turbulence inside the cabin grew increasingly intense, luggage and loose items were thrown around, and passengers screamed as the plane was tossed by the storm. Juliane later recalled her mother calmly, saying, "This is the end, all is lost," a statement that has since become one of the most quoted lines from her account of the disaster. Then came the lightning strike. Witnesses and later investigators confirmed the aircraft was hit directly, igniting the fuel in the right wing and causing catastrophic structural failure. The plane broke apart in midair at an altitude of roughly 2 miles, around 10,000 feet, disintegrating into pieces high above the unbroken green canopy of the Peruvian Amazon. In an instant, Juliane found herself no longer inside a fuselage but falling through open air, still buckled into her 3-seat row, spinning through the sky in what she would later describe as a strange, dreamlike free fall. She reported that she blacked out during the descent, which may have been a small mercy, sparing her the full conscious terror of the plunge. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. The row of seats she was strapped into appears to have acted like a rudimentary parachute or wing, creating drag and slowing the descent, spinning like a sycamore seed rather than dropping straight down. Compounding this stroke of fortune, the storm that caused the crash had also produced powerful updrafts, which may have further slowed her fall. She plummeted into the rainforest canopy, and the thick, layered vegetation, vines, broadleaves, and soft understory growth cushioned the final impact enough to prevent her body from being destroyed on landing. It remains, to this day, the highest fall a human being is confirmed to have survived without a parachute. When Juliane regained consciousness, she was lying on the forest floor, still strapped into her seat, alone. She had suffered a concussion, a broken collarbone, a gashed arm, a torn ligament in one knee, and one eye had swollen shut from the trauma. She had lost her glasses in the fall and could not see clearly. Remarkably, despite the scale of the disaster, her injuries were survivable, a fact that still strikes disaster investigators and physicians as improbable given the height from which she fell. She had landed in dense, remote jungle, far from any town or road, roughly 10 to 12 kilometers from where debris and other bodies would eventually be found scattered across the forest. For the first day, she was too dazed and injured to move much, drifting in and out of consciousness under the jungle canopy as rain continued to fall. When she was lucid enough to think clearly, she began calling out for her mother, hoping against hope that Maria might have survived the fall as well. No one answered. The forest around her was eerily quiet except for the sounds of insects, birds, and dripping rain, an environment she recognized instinctively, since it so closely resembled the terrain surrounding her parents' remote research station. This familiarity, born of years spent at Panguana learning about the ecology, dangers, and rhythms of the rainforest, would soon become her only real asset in the days of survival that followed. But that part of the story, her arduous trek through the jungle alone, belongs to the chapters that come after this one, the initial catastrophe and fall that placed her, alone and injured, at the mercy of one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The fall itself has since been studied by aviation safety experts, physicists, and physicians interested in the physics of high-altitude survival, deceleration forces, and the rare conditions that allow a human body to survive an otherwise fatal drop. Juliane's case is frequently cited alongside a small number of other extreme fall survival stories, though hers remains the most extensively documented and the highest confirmed fall of its kind. It set the stage, quite literally by dropping her into the heart of the Amazon, for an 11-day fight for survival that would test everything she had learned from her upbringing among Peru's rainforest wildlife and terrain. When Juliane Koepcke fell from the shattered fuselage of LANSA Flight 508, she was still fastened into her row of 3 seats, a detail that investigators and survival researchers would later point to as one of the crucial factors in her survival. The seat row, rather than acting as dead weight, likely behaved somewhat like a rudimentary auto-rotating wing or parachute canopy, catching air and spinning as it descended rather than dropping in a straight, uncontrolled plunge. This spinning motion, similar to the way a maple seed twirls to the ground, would have created drag and slowed her rate of descent just enough to matter. Combined with the powerful, chaotic air currents generated by the tropical storm that brought down the plane, including updrafts that may have buoyed her fall at points, the physics of her descent were unusual enough that she survived a drop that, by any ordinary calculation, should have been fatal many times over. She fell nearly 2 miles, close to 10,000 feet, from the point where the plane disintegrated in the sky to the moment she came to rest on the rainforest floor. To this day, hers remains the highest confirmed fall a human has ever survived without a parachute, a distinction that has made her case a subject of ongoing interest among aviation safety experts and physicians studying deceleration trauma. What makes the outcome even more remarkable is that Juliane says she lost consciousness at some point during the fall itself, meaning she has no full memory of the descent. She recalls the initial chaos, the sound of the storm, her mother's chilling words, and then the sensation of spinning through open air, before her memory goes dark until she awoke on the ground. Some who have studied her account suggest this blackout may have been a small mercy, sparing her the sustained horror of a conscious 2-mile fall, though it also means the full physical experience of the descent itself remains something she can never entirely reconstruct. The other essential piece of the miracle was where she landed. The Peruvian Amazon rainforest is not uniform. It consists of towering emergent trees, a dense mid-canopy, and thick undergrowth layered with vines, ferns, and soft, decomposing plant matter on the forest floor. Juliane came down into this multi-layered green cushion rather than onto open ground, rock, or water, and the successive layers of vegetation appear to have absorbed and dispersed the force of the impact incrementally, slowing her fall further in the final moments before she hit the ground. Had she fallen even a short distance from where she did, into a clearing, a river, or a stand of harder timber, the outcome would almost certainly have been different. In this sense, her survival was not the result of a single fortunate factor but a chain of improbable circumstances working together, the seat row's aerodynamic behavior, the turbulent updrafts of the storm, and the cushioning effect of the exact patch of jungle canopy she happened to fall into. Despite surviving the fall itself, Juliane's body bore the marks of the trauma. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the ground, still buckled into her seat, with a concussion that had left her disoriented and unsure at first of where she was or what had happened. She had a broken collarbone, a deep gash on one arm, and a ligament injury to one knee that would make walking painful and difficult in the days that followed. One eye had swollen shut, and because her glasses had been torn away during the fall, her vision was blurred and limited even out of her uninjured eye, a serious handicap for someone about to navigate dense, disorienting rainforest terrain alone. Yet none of her injuries were life-threatening on their own, an outcome that still strikes trauma physicians as extraordinary given that she had just fallen from cruising altitude. It took time for her to process what had happened. Drifting in and out of awareness in the hours after she landed, rain falling steadily around her as the storm that caused the crash continued to move through the region, she was in no condition to move far or fast. She began calling out, first in confusion and then with mounting desperation, for her mother, hoping that Maria Koepcke might have survived the same fall nearby. There was no answer, only the ordinary sounds of the rainforest, insects, bird calls, water dripping from leaves, closing back in around her as if nothing catastrophic had just happened at all. She was, in that moment, entirely alone, a badly injured teenage girl lying in one of the most remote and biologically hostile environments on the planet, with no rescue coming and no one aware that she, alone among the scattered wreckage of Flight 508, had lived. The improbability of her landing has since made her case a touchstone in discussions of survivability limits in aviation accidents, cited in studies of fall dynamics, crash trauma, and the rare set of conditions under which a human body can withstand forces that are almost always instantly fatal. But for Juliane herself, in the immediate aftermath, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had survived the impossible only to find herself facing an entirely new and equally dangerous ordeal, staying alive, injured and half-blind, deep in the Amazon rainforest, with no idea how she would find her way out. When Juliane Koepcke finally gathered enough strength and clarity of mind to move, the first thing she did was search for her mother. She and Maria had been sitting together on the plane when it broke apart, and in the chaos and blackout of the fall, Juliane had lost all sense of what became of her. Waking alone on the jungle floor, injured and half-blind without her glasses, her first instinct was not to think about her own survival but to call out for Maria, hoping that her mother had somehow landed nearby, just as she had. She shouted into the dense green silence around her, straining to hear any response over the ordinary sounds of the forest, dripping water, insects, distant bird calls, but no answering voice ever came. This search, and the growing dread that accompanied its failure, would define her first days on the ground almost as much as the physical struggle to survive. She began to crawl and then walk in short, painful stretches, hampered by her broken collarbone, her injured knee, and her blurred vision. She scanned the wreckage-strewn ground around her, aware that pieces of the aircraft and its passengers had been scattered across a wide stretch of jungle when the plane disintegrated in the sky. What she found in those initial searches was devastating. Rather than survivors, she came across debris, luggage, and the remains of other passengers who had not been as fortunate as she was in the manner and location of their fall. The realization set in gradually and painfully. Unlike her, whose seat row had spun down through the canopy in a way that slowed her descent and cushioned her landing, most of the other 91 people aboard Flight 508 had fallen or gone down with the main wreckage without any such fortune, and had died instantly or in the crash itself. Juliane, still only 17, was forced to process this horror almost entirely alone, with no adult to guide her, comfort her, or confirm what she was seeing. She had grown up around the rainforest and understood its rhythms better than most teenagers ever would, thanks to years spent at her parents' remote research station, but nothing could have prepared her for walking through the aftermath of a mass casualty event by herself, half-blind, in pain, and increasingly aware that she might be the only person who had survived. She continued to call her mother's name for some time, refusing to give up hope entirely, clinging to the possibility that Maria might be alive somewhere nearby, perhaps injured and unable to answer, rather than gone. This hope, however faint, seems to have helped anchor her in those first disorienting hours, giving her a reason to keep searching and moving rather than simply lying down in shock and despair. As she widened her search, she found herself confronting the scale of the disaster more directly. She has since described coming across the remnants of the crash in ways that made clear no one nearby had survived the initial impact, a grim confirmation that whatever slim chance had spared her body during the fall had not been extended to those who went down with the main body of the plane or fell without the same aerodynamic accident of a spinning seat row. There was no way for her, alone in the jungle with limited vision and a concussion clouding her thinking, to conduct anything like a thorough search of the crash site, which investigators would later determine was spread out over a significant area of dense, largely impassable terrain. She could only search what was immediately around her, and what she found there offered no comfort and no sign of her mother. At some point in this process, exhausted, injured, and increasingly aware that she was entirely alone, Juliane made the decision that would ultimately save her life. Rather than continuing to wait passively at the crash site in the hope of rescue, she resolved to try to find her own way out of the jungle. This decision drew directly on what she had absorbed growing up around her parents' research work. She knew that in the Amazon, moving water almost always leads eventually to larger water, and larger water eventually leads to human settlements. She recalled specific advice her father had given her about wilderness survival, including the idea that following a stream downhill was one of the most reliable ways to eventually encounter people, since Peruvian rainforest communities and logging camps were invariably built along rivers. This piece of practical knowledge, learned casually during a childhood spent in and around the jungle rather than in any formal survival training, became the single most important strategic decision of her entire ordeal. Before setting out, she is said to have made a final search of the immediate area, still hoping against hope to find her mother alive or to at least locate other survivors who might join her. She found neither. The forest offered no answers, only silence and the scattered, terrible evidence of the crash. With no choice left but to rely on herself, injured, exhausted, grieving, and profoundly alone, she turned away from the wreckage and began walking toward the sound of trickling water nearby, starting what would become an 11-day trek through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. It was a decision made not out of certainty but out of necessity, the only rational path forward for a badly hurt teenage girl who had just learned, in the worst way imaginable, that she alone had lived. Once Juliane Koepcke made the decision to leave the crash site and follow moving water, her survival over the next 11 days became a direct test of everything she had absorbed, often without realizing it at the time, from her childhood spent at Panguana, her parents' remote research station in the Peruvian Amazon. Her mother and father were both trained scientists who had spent years studying the ecology, wildlife, and terrain of the rainforest, and Juliane had grown up moving between the modern comforts of Lima and the wild, biologically intense environment of the jungle. This upbringing meant that, unlike most people who might have found themselves in her situation, she was not encountering the rainforest as an alien and incomprehensible threat. She understood, at least in broad terms, which dangers were real and which were exaggerated, and she had internalized certain practical lessons that would prove critical to her survival. The most important of these was her father's advice that in this kind of terrain, following flowing water downhill was the most reliable way to eventually find people. Rivers and streams in the Amazon almost always lead to larger waterways, and human settlements, whether indigenous communities, missionary outposts, or logging camps, are consistently built along these waterways rather than scattered through the deep forest. Juliane located a small stream near the crash site and began wading and walking along it, reasoning that even if progress was slow, the stream would eventually widen and lead her toward civilization. This was not a guess but a calculated strategy, and it shaped nearly every decision she made over the following days, even when exhaustion, pain, and fear urged her to stop. Her physical condition made this trek agonizingly difficult. She had a concussion, a broken collarbone, a deep gash on one arm, and a torn ligament in one knee, and she could barely see out of one swollen eye while her vision in the other remained blurred without her glasses. She waded through waist-deep water for long stretches, since walking directly along the slippery, root-tangled banks was often more dangerous than moving through the stream itself. She had almost no food, only a small bag of hard candy salvaged from the wreckage, which she rationed carefully over the following days rather than consuming quickly, understanding that she had no idea how long her journey would take. She did not attempt to eat unfamiliar plants or fruit, a decision informed by her awareness that many rainforest plants are toxic and that misidentifying edible food could kill her faster than hunger alone. She also had to manage a specific and growing danger that most people would never have anticipated. Her arm wound had become infested with maggots. Rather than panicking, Juliane recalled information from her upbringing suggesting that maggots, while distressing, were not immediately life-threatening and were in a strange way, preventing the wound from becoming more severely infected by consuming dead tissue. She reasoned that removing them without proper tools might cause more harm, including introducing more severe infection, and so she largely left the wound alone rather than trying to dig them out with her hands, a decision that likely helped prevent a worse outcome by the time she was eventually found. Her knowledge of the jungle also helped her avoid dangers that might have proven fatal to someone unfamiliar with the environment. She knew, for instance, of the danger posed by kangaroo, a small parasitic catfish rumored among river communities to be able to swim into the human body, and she avoided urinating directly into the water as a precaution some locals practiced, staying alert to a specific, if partly folkloric, regional hazard. She was cautious around caimans and other creatures that might inhabit the waters she waded through, understanding the rainforest well enough to move carefully rather than recklessly, even in her weakened, half-blind state. This kind of practical, lived familiarity with the ecosystem, rather than panic or blind instinct, repeatedly kept her from making fatal mistakes during a trek that stretched on far longer than she likely anticipated when she first began walking. Beyond physical survival, she had to manage profound psychological strain. She was alone, grieving the likely loss of her mother, uncertain whether she would ever be found, and moving through a landscape that offered no reassurance, no other human voices, and no sign of how far she still had to go. She has since described the days blending together in a haze of pain, fatigue, and dogged determination, punctuated by moments of despair when the stream seemed to lead nowhere and her strength was failing. Yet she kept moving, driven by the same practical logic that had guided her from the start: keep following the water, because water leads to people, and people mean rescue. Over the course of roughly 9 or 10 days, the small stream she had first entered gradually widened into a larger river, exactly as her father's advice had predicted it would. Her physical condition continued to deteriorate, but her strategy was working, slowly closing the distance between her and any sign of human presence. This period represents the heart of her survival story, not a single dramatic act of heroism but a sustained, day-after-day application of jungle knowledge, discipline, and sheer endurance, carried out by an injured teenage girl who had lost her mother, her glasses, and nearly everything else in the crash, but not her clear-headed understanding of the environment she had grown up in. By the 9th or 10th day of her ordeal, Juliane Koepcke had been wading and walking along the stream she had chosen to follow since leaving the crash site, and it had gradually widened into a larger river, just as her father's advice about jungle survival had predicted it would. Her physical condition by this point was severe. She was malnourished, having survived on nothing but a small bag of hard candy rationed carefully over more than a week, and she was suffering from her untreated injuries, including the wound on her arm that had become infested with maggots, a concussion, a broken collarbone, and a torn ligament in her knee that made walking painful and slow. She was also exhausted in a way that went beyond ordinary tiredness, the cumulative toll of more than a week spent alone in the jungle, grieving her mother, uncertain whether she would survive each new day, and pushing forward on willpower and a single strategic idea rather than any certainty of success. It was around this point, on the 10th day by most accounts of her story, that she came across a small boat tied up along the riverbank, along with a rudimentary shelter nearby that showed clear signs of use by local workers. She recognized this immediately as one of the most important discoveries of her entire ordeal, since it meant she had finally reached a point in the river where people were present, at least intermittently, even if no one was there at that exact moment. Rather than simply waiting passively, she made the decision to siphon a small amount of gasoline or fuel from a container near the boat and use it to treat the open wound on her arm, understanding that the maggots inside it needed to be addressed and that the fuel, however crude a remedy, might help clean the wound in a way that could prevent a worsening infection. This was a painful but calculated act, consistent with the same practical, unsentimental problem-solving that had characterized her decisions throughout the entire ordeal. She waited near the shelter, too weak and injured to continue further on her own, hoping that whoever used the boat and camp would return before too long. Her patience and judgment paid off. The following day, a group of local Peruvian loggers working in the area arrived at the camp and found her there, an experience she has described as almost unbelievable to the men who encountered her, a badly injured, emaciated teenage girl, alone, having apparently survived not only a plane crash but 11 days alone in one of the most remote and dangerous rainforest environments in the world. The loggers, though shocked, responded with care and urgency. They gave her food and attended to her injuries as best they could with the limited supplies available at a remote logging camp, and recognizing that she needed far more medical attention than they could provide, they arranged to transport her further downriver by boat, a journey that took the better part of a day, to reach a location where she could be flown out. From there, she was airlifted to a hospital in Koepcke, the very town she and her mother had originally been flying toward when Flight 508 went down. It was there, finally, that Juliane was reunited with her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, who had been informed of the crash and had presumably spent the preceding days and weeks fearing the worst about both his wife and his daughter. Their reunion marked the effective end of her personal ordeal, though the emotional aftermath, including the eventual confirmation of her mother Maria's death, extended the trauma of the event well beyond the physical rescue itself. Search teams, aided in part by information Juliane was able to provide once she was found, later located the site of her mother's remains, allowing for a degree of closure that had not been possible during Juliane's own solitary trek through the jungle. The rescue made international headlines, both because of the sheer improbability of her survival and because of the specific details of her ordeal, falling nearly 2 miles from a disintegrating aircraft, surviving 11 days alone in the Amazon rainforest with only rudimentary supplies and jungle knowledge gained from an unusual upbringing, and ultimately finding her way to safety through calm, methodical decision-making rather than panic. In the years that followed, Juliane went on to study biology, eventually earning a doctorate and becoming a mammologist, following in the footsteps of both of her parents' scientific careers. She returned, decades later, to the region of the crash and to her parents' former research station at Panguana, which she has worked to preserve and support as a nature reserve, and she has written and spoken publicly about her experience, offering her account not as a tale of extraordinary heroism but as an honest record of what happened to her, shaped by grief for her mother, gratitude for having survived, and a lasting connection to the rainforest that had nearly killed her and ultimately saved her at the same time. Her story has since become one of the most studied and referenced accounts of extreme human survival, cited in both scientific literature on fall trauma and in popular culture as an enduring symbol of resilience under nearly impossible circumstances. What happened to Juliane Koepcke was never supposed to be possible. A fall from 2 miles above the earth, without a parachute, without warning, and without a single moment to prepare for what was coming. And yet she lived, not through some miracle that defies explanation, but through a rare and almost unrepeatable chain of circumstances, a spinning seat row that slowed her descent, a violent storm that may have cushioned her fall with its own currents, and a dense, layered rainforest canopy that absorbed the impact her body should never have survived. To this day, hers remains the highest fall a human being has ever survived without a parachute, a record that exists not because it was designed, but because everything, against all odds, happened to align. But surviving the fall was only half the story. What Juliane did in the 11 days that followed is, in many ways, even more extraordinary than the fall itself. Alone, half-blind, injured, and grieving a mother she would never see again, she made a decision that most people in her position never would have thought to make. She didn't wait. She didn't panic. She moved, guided by a single piece of practical wisdom absorbed not from training or preparation, but from a childhood spent in the rainforest with parents who understood it better than almost anyone alive. Follow the water, and the water will lead you home. It did. Her story endures, more than 50 years later, not simply because of how improbable it was, but because of what it reveals about human resilience under conditions almost no one will ever have to face. She didn't have special equipment. She didn't have rescue teams tracking her exact location. She had knowledge, discipline, and the will to keep moving even when every reasonable expectation said she wouldn't make it. That combination, quiet, methodical, unglamorous survival, is often far more powerful than any single act of heroism, and it's exactly what carried her out of the jungle alive. Juliane went on to become a scientist herself, dedicating much of her life to the very ecosystem that had nearly killed her and ultimately saved her. She returned, years later, to the research station her parents had built, working to protect it rather than walk away from the place tied to so much loss. In many ways, that choice says as much about her as the 11 days in the jungle do. She didn't just survive the rainforest. She made peace with it. If this story left you speechless, imagine living it. Juliane Koepcke's survival remains one of the most extraordinary true stories ever recorded, proof of what the human body and mind can endure when there is truly no other choice left but to keep going. If you want more real survival stories like this one, stories of people who faced the impossible and lived to tell it, make sure you're subscribed, because there are many more still to come. Like and subscribe to watch more of the legendary survival stories humans ever experienced.